It's episode 60, and today I have Robbie Swale, who is a coach, author, and podcaster, joining me on the show. So, yeah, thank you very much for joining me, Robbie.
Yeah, this is a pleasure to be here, and congratulations on 60 episodes.
I know
60 episodes, and you haven't given up yet.
No, not yet. It's been running for about 2 years, and it's really good. So it's an interesting one, and I think we're going to be talking today about the heroic leader. And I think, when we're trying to set anything up, implement positive change, there's something really interesting in that for me about like this idea of being heroic and doing something new or different, and how much that can get in the way. And actually the show for me is kind of almost part of the example. I tried a couple of other podcast formats, and in the end I settled on one I can enjoy and do without too much struggle. And that's why I've done 60 episodes. So I think there's something we're really interested to get into that a bit more later. But so if you happen to be new to the show, welcome. And this show is really, it's a shared exploration of things that sometimes people can take for granted or overlook. Because it really came about because when I was talking to people taking these different approaches, alternative approaches, and really doing quite pioneering work to these kind of complex issues, and Robbie is absolutely one of these people, like all of my guests, then I found that there were these hidden barriers that were often kind of in these assumptions that we just took for granted and didn't really talk about, that sat below what we were actually doing. And so it's about challenging those, surfacing those, exploring those, seeing how true they really are. And so I hope the show gives you specific ideas that can help you in your personal and professional life. But perhaps more importantly, I hope it gives you ideas about how you can go out there and challenge assumptions for yourself. Because I'd like everyone to be able to do this, and this to be a completely normal thing that we do all the time in our personal and professional lives. So the show is Delightful Dissent, because we might well be disagreeing with the prevailing wisdom. We might well be challenging some of the stuff out there, but it's not about proving ourselves right at everyone else's expense. And it's not about taking everything so seriously. It's about being playful and seeing where stuff works and where it doesn't. And the show is genuinely live, so please do bear with us if there are any technical issues. And also please be aware that there may be difficult topics in the show. I think the topics today might well be around kind of unintended consequences of our actions, potentially around burnout and overwhelm, uncertainty, and perhaps particularly around changing in our identity and kind of loss of identity. So if any of those are particularly difficult for you, then please be warned. Also, we may use strong language. So if that is an issue for you, then please also be warned that might come up. There aren't any perfect answers here. This is about exploring and asking questions of yourself, of everyone else. And if you would like to ask us questions and you are watching live, then please do so in the chat. We will potentially be able to bring those in and make them part of the conversation. If you are listening to or watching the recording, then if you have any questions for us, we'll be sharing contact details at the end of the show, and they're also available in the show notes. So, I first met Robbie. We were introduced by a friend of the show, Francis Kalaschi, and we had just a really fun, wide-ranging conversation, but with a really interesting edge for me around getting stuff done in alternative ways, but really getting stuff done. And that really made me want to get Robbie on the show and to share some of his approach with you in the audience. So Robbie, could I ask you perhaps to introduce yourself a bit, kind of who you are, what you do, kind of people you like to work with, please?
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. Total pleasure to be here, and I love. Hopefully, we'll get into this over the next hour or so. this piece, that everything you've just been talking about they feel like they are great qualities that we're hoping to manage to embody in this conversation for dealing with the world, right? So it's like the ability to question assumptions and all of that. So the way I think about my work these days is, I make things mostly. So I'm a podcaster and an author. I have a series of 4 books about creativity, and in my coaching, I make conditions in some ways. So most of the work, the money that I make, comes from coaching I do with individuals or teams or groups, and a lot of the time, then I'm creating a container, creating the conditions for change and transformation to happen. And then the way I talk about my work, the kind of work I do, the people I work with, is usually these days that I'm interested in 3 things really. I'm interested in leadership, and we might get into that and some of the texture around that today. I'm interested in creativity. So particularly I'm interested in the bit, why do we sometimes really want to do things and not do them? Sometimes for a long time. And I say that as somebody personally who's been in that many times. And I know what the kind of creative hell is like when there's a thing you want to do, whether it's a book you want to write or a business or somebody you want to ask out or any of these kind of acts that require creating something from nothing. And so I'm interested in helping people bridge that gap. And that's what I have a series of books called the 12-Minute Method. And that's what those books are about, really. And I'm also interested in the craft of coaching. I think for helping people do exactly what this show's designed to do, question assumptions, which is such an important skill to have in a complex world. And for many other reasons, coaching has a real part to play in helping people deal with what happens in their lives and create change and have an impact. And so I do some work to develop and help other coaches too.
Thank you. That's such a fascinating question for me as well. Why don't we do something that we really want to do? And what's getting in the way of that is such a fascinating question for so many reasons.
Absolutely. And sometimes, often, it's assumptions. And some of those ones you touched on that might be difficult for people. Sometimes it's assumptions about who we are and what we can and can't do and our identity, and shifting those things can be difficult, but it can also be incredibly empowering if we can do it in the right way.
Absolutely. So how did you arrive at doing this? Well, what brought you to doing this particular thing?
I mean, like, I could tell it in a story where it sounds quite organized, but it's chance, right? It's a messy, life is what brought me to doing this thing. But let me do a little bit to give a bit of context, a bit of storytelling, but it definitely wasn't as neat as this. On one level, in the first decade of my career, you could kind of say I did 2 or 3 different careers. And each time I left them behind, in some way, there was a kind of sense for me that there was more I could be giving. There was a part of me that wasn't getting. So I at one point I thought I might be an actor, and I got quite far down that route in lots of ways. And I just knew at one point, one of the key moments for me in leaving that behind in my mid-20s was I knew there were parts of me that wouldn't get used by that. And later, when I worked in events and venue management in North Yorkshire, where I was living at the time, and when I was leaving that behind, it was a sense that there were other people who would the way I think about it now is there were other people who would thrive in the doing of that job in a way that I didn't. I liked what we made happen. I liked that the events and the youth theatres and the volunteering opportunities happened because of the work I did. But the actual doing, I found, it wasn't that I was bad at it, but I just found it drained my energy a lot. And I knew there were people who would just love that in a way that I didn't. And it was quite a thing for me to shift out of that. And so I was really looking to try and some idealistic view, I think, that I could try and have everything in work, really. I could have some work that I loved and I was good at, and that was making as big a contribution as I could as a single human make. And after various false starts, lots of messiness, insecurity, worry, jealousy, and all kinds of things, I came to coaching, having looked at it once and thought this isn't right and gone away and done some training and other things, some counseling training, looked at different things, tried working in HR. I knew there was something about people was in there for me when I'd done some analysis on my previous work. And in the end, I came to coaching and I did some coaching training, essentially thinking, well, at the very least, this training will be useful because it's training about how to deal with people and how to support people wherever I end up. But maybe this will be the thing. And then now we're about 7 years later, and so far, this is the thing, although I'm not going to say it's going to be the thing forever. And then in that thing, the container of coaching has allowed me to explore all kinds of things, mostly the things like the podcasts, like the books have emerged from my exploration of myself. So where it's almost looking at where are the things that I want to do on some level and I'm not doing, and what happens if I do them. And those journeys have changed me, but have also helped me create some pieces of work.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that experience of struggling to fit all aspects of oneself into a predefined role, particularly in an organization, is something very resonant for the audience in this show in particular, and for me as well. It's a real challenge when you see things from a slightly different perspective and join different things together. And I think this can be one of the, on some level, it's almost that leadership by default or unwittingly, is like finding oneself in a position where one is doing something new and changing things, not because one wanted that position, if you see what I mean, but because you were like, oh, well, I think this is important to change and I'm in a position to do it, rather than the other way around, if you see what I mean, which I think is often how I've thought of leadership. Like, people think they want to be leaders. Is kind of part of me always says, well, why would anyone want to be in that position? We just kind of find ourselves in it.
I mean, I think some of the reasons, they're not very conscious ones, but they're like, well, like a lot of the reasons people end up in leadership roles is kind of money, and to progress through a hierarchy, and prestige. And those are not nothing. None of those things are nothing, right? They're all, useful and good things in their own way. But it's a really different thing to think about leadership in that way, as opposed to thinking about it in the way that you're talking about, which is there's a change that could happen here that could make things better. And I am in a position to make it. And so am I going to do that? Which in some way is leadership or not. And that's a really different thing. And it's harder in some ways, because it's like we can all follow albeit it's not always easy, but we can all follow an expected route, a pattern which says get a job, work your way up in it in an organization. Like, that's in some ways that's easier. You get into a company and what does a good person in this company do? Speech marks good person, someone who's a good worker. Well, they probably contribute more each year, and they probably work their way up, and they probably get rewarded for hard work and all that kind of thing. It's a lot harder to sit in the world, I think, and go, okay, I could change something. What do I want to change?
Absolutely. So do you have a quote that you'd like to share with us before we really get into this topic?
Yeah, I'd love to. So this is a quote by the British fantasy novelist David Gemmell. More specifically, it's the character Caris in the book Dark Moon. And amongst other great things that she says, heroes are people who face down their fears. It is that simple.
Interesting. What's coming to mind for me right now is the Litany Against Fear from Dune, in Frank Herbert's Dune.
I read that book a long time ago. I keep meaning to go back to it so that I can then watch the movie. Do you remember the Litany Against Fear well enough to bring it in?
No. I'll mangle it if I do.
Yeah.
So yes,
Google it, watchers. And
I might quietly Google it whilst if we have a chance to do so. But yeah, I really recommend checking it out. Also, as read or acted, it's in pretty much all of the versions of Dune that have been recorded as well. I think it's a really, really interesting set of ideas, and yeah, that relationship between that thing about engaging with fear. I think that's, for me, what really jumps out in your quote. It's not the avoidance. It's not necessarily the minimization, but the engagement. And I think this idea of, like, the hero as being invulnerable. You know, it makes me think, which is so unreal and uninteresting, versus like someone who does actually feel. And it's a really, you know, it really brings that to me. It's like, you know, if you're heroic, you shouldn't be afraid. Is like there's an assumption there, and it really, yeah, it really helps me think about that. But what is it that made you want to share that particular quote?
Yeah, well, I mean, part of it is because one of the things that I wished I'd done for a long time and nearly didn't do and then did. So one of the first times that in some ways I faced down fear. So for me, making things, taking those acts of doing those things that I've been meaning to do for a long time, it's often fear, if you dig deep enough, that stops us doing those things. And one of the things that I had on my list for a long time, and I'd seen other ideas come and be done by other people essentially, that I'd had, and I didn't want this one to be. And for some reason, that was meaning in some weird fear trick that I was holding it to myself, was making a website about that particular fantasy novelist. Because I'd realized that I'd learned, you know, often, and June is another great example, you know, as is the fact that Yoda is quoted, you know, so often. Like fantasy stories, and Star Wars is absolutely a fantasy story, often contain pretty deep truths about humanity, and not always, I should say, but often they do. Often that's one of the things that they are able to do through those mechanisms that they're allowed in that genre. And I realized that I was hugely influenced by those philosophical ideas that were in David Gemmell's books. He was a British novelist writing between kind of 1984 and when he died in 2006. It was just a big part of who I was. And I hadn't made this website, and I knew that there was a website that could be made, and it took me a long time and some coaching from somebody else to get through the fears and do it. And a lot of it is about that kind of concept that the character Karis is talking about in that book, which is exactly like I say, how to engage with fear. You know, one of the other things he would say in there, a character in David Gemmell's book might say is, you know, fear's not a bad thing, right? It's there to keep us alive, but the choice is exactly how we engage with it. I think another one that I might have chosen is, the coward hides from fear and the hero rides it like a wild stallion. Right? Something like that. But it's not about, exactly like you say, it's not about invulnerability in heroes. And that's the thing in David Gemmell's books, that anyone who loves David Gemmell will love this about it. And of course, there are people that don't, and that's perfect and fine. I don't mind that. I know why people wouldn't. But we'll love the shades of grey in the characters. Also, just a quick one, because I've been interested in heroes really since I was a little boy. Whether that's King Arthur or Robin Hood or superheroes. And, you know, there's no surprise that, like Superman, I don't know if you know this, they had to make him less invulnerable because he stopped being interesting.
They invented kryptonite because otherwise you couldn't write interesting stories.
Exactly. Yeah. And I think that, you know, there's probably a reason that Spider-Man and Batman are broadly more successful, you know, more widely known, more engaging superheroes than Superman, because they both are flawed characters with problems, especially the early parts of Spider-Man's story.
And I think there's something around this, you know, when I think about the heroic leader and how, if I think of myself in relation to that as an idea, and it's not an idea I identify with at all, either of them really, actually, either hero or leader. It's something other people have said to me, and both, you know, doing what I do, and people go, really admirable, you know, you're doing amazing. It doesn't feel that way. And I think there's something really around, like, how are we identifying with these qualities around this? And certainly my assumptions around what it means to do this are very much around, being kind of invulnerable, being easy, having the answers already. And that doesn't really reflect the reality, but it does also make me question exactly how much, like, those things are meaningful as ideas.
Do you mean how much like heroism or leadership are meaningful as ideas?
Yeah, and I think there's something of a kind of everyday heroism, and that it isn't necessarily splashy, and like that for some people it's a heroic act to get out of bed in the morning, and that is exactly what we're talking about. It is to face down one's fear, and I've been in that place in my life where that was the hardest thing. And yeah, there's something around that and our ideas of what heroism looks like, I think, and what leadership looks like. So for you, yeah, how do you relate to, first of all, that idea of either of those not being like what we think of them as like, but also, yeah, how how do you think of those things as looking?
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing to say is probably, I don't know if this is true of all the assumptions you try and tackle, but I'm just catching that, probably what we're talking about here is there's a like projection onto those two words that as a society or a group of people we generally somehow do. And what we need to do now is just detach. What I think we're inviting people to do in this conversation, or we're inviting each other to do, is detach ourselves from the solid meaning that we have given to the words leadership and hero, and create a more textured meaning for them that is more useful for how most of us live our lives. So I kind of wanted to say that on a high level. Then I wanted to just really say that, personally, much more meaningful to me is the everyday heroism, like the acts of courage. I don't think I'll ever forget this. One of the most meaningful coaching sessions I've ever delivered was a free of charge one. So often when people want to work with me, I'll gift them a session, because what we want to do is find out, like, actually, should we be doing this work? Should I be doing it with you? And I gifted a session to a potential client, and we met in the center of London, and we didn't end up working together. But what emerged over the conversation was that for this particular woman, coming to this meeting was in itself an act of absolute courage and absolute heroism, right? It was like meeting a stranger in the South Bank Centre in the center of London, and in doing that, saying, I want to change this thing that's happening in my life, was one of the most inspiring things I've ever seen. Much more inspiring than I've ever found the CEO of anything. And so for me, I think it does speak to what it means to, what it actually means to be heroic, for me at least. And on leadership, another kind of different but similar story. I'll probably always remember. I sometimes call myself a leadership coach often, because if you just call yourself a coach, people are like, what? And I want a word. Really, the reason I use a word there is I want a word that will start some conversations with the people who I think might be interested in the kind of work I do. And that's why now I say leadership and creativity usually. But leadership is a word that I'm interested in for all the reasons we're kind of getting into. And I remember working with a client once who told me that, I can't remember how she said it, but she basically said, she kind of implied I almost didn't do this because I'm not a leader. And to me, like, I looked at this woman, I was like, how can you possibly believe that? She was obviously influencing, changing, leading people in pretty much every environment she was in her family and education communities. We'd met through a training course, and by without even trying, she was kind of helping everybody else on the training learn more. And it was so obvious to me that this woman was doing amazing things in the world that I would call leadership. And so it does feel to me like we always have to be careful with language. If we don't imbue enough meaning in a word, then the word is meaningless, right? But if we imbue too much meaning and too solid a meaning, then it can become a story that holds us back instead of an invitation that draws us on, something like that.
Reflecting on actually this show, one of the interesting things about this show is how I have to actively invite most guests. Very few people self-identify as being like the kind of person that they would to be on the show, and it's a very strange experience actually, because I'm like, of course people would want, like, I approach a lot of people and I'm like, are they actually going to say yes to this? Would they want to do? And they're like, oh yes, you want me on the show? It's a weird, like, there's something interesting in that, both sides of it. I think, and how we are identifying other people's leadership and not our own. And it also makes me think about what derives from just us being us versus what it is that we kind of act and do and is about external markers. Because one of the big things for me and in my work is really, moving towards this place where we have more of our effect in the world just as a result of being, just a result of how we are and what flows through that, what we create by just being, rather than this very effortful external kind of thing. What do we change by being? Very often, that kind of is catalysis in like a literal sense. It's like with a catalyst, just by kind of its physical shape, almost lets a reaction happen that wouldn't otherwise happen. And it's like, how do we create those circumstances rather than this kind of changing, acting upon ourselves? And I think sometimes that we are intrinsically led to this, that this is there is some aspect where we are displaying leadership is one of the interesting things, I think, for me, versus, again, whether people have kind of chosen a position of leadership. There's something I'd really love to explore with you around, like, what is it to find oneself in leadership versus to choose it?
Yeah, or be chosen, a bit like you're choosing people for the show, right? And I think it's really interesting, and I'm just kind of starting to get a picture of what, because I think we have both, we haven't explicitly named it in any of our conversations, this conversation or previous ones, I don't think, like, what is the heroic leader that people see? And we've named a few things in this. I think we've named they are invulnerable, they have the answers, and most people don't feel like one. Like even the people that you're picking to come on the show, who, like, on the outside to you look completely like the right people for the show, they don't feel on the inside like one, because they know they're not invulnerable, right? And I'll always remember one of my mentors talking about what an unfair comparison it is to compare what's going on for other people on the outside with what's happening for us on the inside. Because most of the time, especially in the social media age, we see a really shiny version of the outside versus a totally messy, normally messy, by default definition, messy internal human that we experience ourselves as being. Then the other piece that comes to mind in what you're saying, I think, is really interesting. So I wonder if the heroic leader, like a person who genuinely could, I don't think I believe this, but let's see if I explore it where it gets to. I wonder if in speech marks simpler times, and there is an assumption there that I'm making, which I think is based on good learning, which is that the world we live in now is more complex than the world was 60 years ago. I wonder if it was more possible for a human, like one human, to be a kind of heroic leader 60 years ago than it is today. And that today, effective leadership, almost by definition, like the world is too complex for a single human to kind of choose to be the leader and then control in any way. And therefore the only way for us to lead is to lead through being and through catalysis, because we're able to, if I've said that word right, because we have to be just a thing in the system which positively influences the system as far as we can. And that's really hard, because in a complex system, we make stuff worse as often as we make stuff better. But we can kind of do the work as a human. One of the ways I think about this for myself and with clients is I can do the work to get myself in that place where my strengths are being used, and I can do some work on myself so I'm being, what would we say, like as wise as I can be about what's likely to make things better and what might make things worse, and then be trying to choose one and not the other. But that really, and I think this is really hard in organizations, like I see it with my clients and I really feel for them, It's really hard to do in those places, because there's a lot of expectations heaped on somebody because of their role title to be doing things and seen to be doing things. And we kind of measure success a lot in that kind of way, whereas being, allowing things to emerge through us, not knowing the answers, admitting that we don't know the answers, which often helps other people create like better answers. All of those things are often kind of frowned upon, seen as not being leadership, all those kind of things. So that's quite a lot from me, Matthew. So feel free to jump off that anywhere.
No, I think it's really helpful. Thank you for kind of framing that. And I completely agree. I think one of the things I've noticed recently is how untenable a lot of leadership positions now seem to be, for anyone who doesn't have certain traits that make them ill-suited to the leadership position. Actually, there's a kind of design question there, and I see people who are kind of well-intentioned and who lead positive change and development, but who are ground down by those positions. And then I see people who are not well-intentioned, who seek those positions and then exploit them at the cost of everyone else. And I think there's something really interesting for me. It's almost like a design question around, if we're expecting this of people, we're demanding a kind of heroic leader. What are we setting up for ourselves when we're looking for that in someone? Because it doesn't feel like there's a invulnerability kind of comes with insensitivity. And I think for me, when I think about the hero, there's what sometimes gets called stoic, but actually probably is not entirely accurate, which is essentially a non-feeling. They're not necessarily aware. And I think the heroic leader of like leading the charge, and surviving whilst everyone else around them is killed, feels like a kind of, we have that part of the heroic leader is that kind of leading and causing harm and not necessarily being able to be aware of that, that not being part of the framing, that being able to block off awareness. And I feel like there's really something about this. Actually, how can we create leadership positions where awareness is, where increased awareness, increased sensitivity is actually supported and encouraged and is selected for rather than selected against?
Yeah, absolutely. I love the framing of, the kind of, we're designing for leaders who are insensitive, because it's actually, if you're a sensitive human, almost impossible to survive in those situations because you're not invulnerable. And the amount of stuff that people in the public eye in 2022 have to put up with, whatever you think about them as humans, right? And the job they do, whether they're a political leader or a business leader, the amount of stuff they have to put up with in social media hate, no matter how good they or bad they are, is appalling. And it's almost like you couldn't survive that, almost. Now, there are some people that I think do, but it's very tough. And then I want to catch that it's like, essentially, I think we need more integration, because I think that what you were we're pointing at is if we're not sensitive enough, there's a kind of invulnerability which leads to callousness, which leads to poor decisions and harm. And then if we're too sensitive, it's going to be really hard to hold a position where our decisions have consequences, because Any complex decision is going to, especially imagine a political leader, right? Any decision they make is going to create some benefits, and it's going to be some people that face harm from that. And if we're too sensitive to that, then that's going to be very hard to keep going in. It reminds me of, I can't remember if we've spoken about this before. There's a book I love by Diana Chapman and Kaylee Klemp and Jim Detmer called The 15 Commitments of Conscious Leadership. And one of the things, I don't think this is their idea, but one of the things I learned about in that book, or read in that book, they point out that they're talking, I think, about the drama triangle, right, with the hero and the villain and the victim in it. So people can look up drama triangles, or we can talk about it more if we want to. But essentially, in that drama triangle, the hero is as damaging as the villain. And we might talk about the hero and the villain in that situation as the villain being someone who, or maybe the hero and the victim, right, as a leader. So it's like the victim might be somebody who doesn't take any responsibility for everything that's happened. Everything is the villain's fault. But the hero is someone who takes too much responsibility for what's happening. And what we actually need in a leader is someone who takes, and pretty much what's useful for all of us in all areas of our life, but really hard to hold, is to take exactly one person's worth of responsibility for the things that we do. And I find this really hard. I take too much responsibility for sure. And the damaging side of that for me is I feel like the whole world is on me. Sometimes I feel like, it's probably why I got so worried about whether acting would be contributing enough, because it's like the world needs, someone's got to sort this out, and I've got that, but it's not healthy for me because it raises the pressure, it raises stress, and it makes things difficult. But neither is it useful to not take enough responsibility, because if we're not taking enough, then, a mentor of mine says something pithy like, innocence breeds impotence. So if nothing is our fault / responsibility, we can't do anything about anything. So I think it's that really tough integration. We probably are aiming for a leader who takes their right level of responsibility and then sees the world as clearly as they can through that.
There's something really interesting in this, in responsibility and the ability to respond, the ability to, and that implies resourcing, that implies having capacity.
Yeah.
And I think there's something really interesting for me in that, and where we're asking ourselves, what we're asking of ourselves and what we're asking of other people is this actually a human capacity? Is this something that someone can respond to? And equally for me, particularly with my work, is this capacity something we can reasonably ask of someone who also has the set of capabilities we need in this space? The example is essentially, is the job for a scalpel or is it for an axe? Because you don't want to shave with an axe, or razor blade. You don't want to shave with an axe. You don't want to try and cut a tree down with a razor blade. And is that essentially what we're asking of ourselves or asking someone to do? And I think that, this heroic leader is also this kind of universal. They can do anything and everything. And I think for me, what I'm understanding from this conversation is that rather than thinking of the heroic leader as a universal, it's about a context that's meaningful for us, that is ours. And that implies a kind of plurality of heroic leaders, rather than either expecting of ourselves or expecting of someone else to do all of it. But that there's some of it.
Yeah. And there's so much in there. Let me throw a couple of things that came to mind back. One is thinking about the scalpel and the axe. I think that one of the people that would get pointed at as a heroic leader is probably Winston Churchill. Now, I'm not a Churchill scholar, so I may be getting this wrong, but as I understand it, he was a quite unsuccessful he was a politician for a long time, and in terms of becoming leader of the country, that was very unlikely, except there happened to be a set of circumstances which called for exactly the tool that Churchill was. And he was therefore, I mean, in some ways, successful in that time.
And
go on, yeah.
In his early political career, Churchill did some deeply distasteful and troubling things.
Yeah.
Including particularly including really, really things that I think a lot of people would genuinely find difficult, and did in that era actually as well.
Yeah.
It's not necessarily a modern thing, but you're right, he was selected at a time when his particular way of being was the most appropriate way of coping, and interestingly, almost immediately deselected.
Right, exactly. Like it was really a tool. You know, he was a tool for a time, and again, I'm not a scholar, but I think that we would broadly accept that it was really important work that he did in the face of something. And I actually really like that you've brought in. I wasn't thinking about that. I read some of those stories a few years ago about Churchill when it must have been an anniversary of something, and they were coming back to the surface in the British media. And I think it's really important because it's like, there you go. You know, he's not a perfect human. He definitely wasn't, right? He was incredibly, as I understand it, flawed in lots of ways. And that doesn't lessen the heroic work that it's, to me, looks like he did in that time. But the other thing to say about people like Churchill is I was very convinced. There's a book by Matt Ridley called The Evolution of Everything, and I was very convinced by his argument in that essentially there are no great people. There are just people who happen to be there at the right time. And I think he used Churchill as an example, and probably said something similar to what you just said, actually, about being deselected afterwards. And he spelled out a few times, and I've seen Malcolm Gladwell make similar arguments, that, you know, a lot of it is the circumstance. There is a time when there is a space for change to happen, and some people become part of that. But a lot of it is down to chance. And for me, I take that as comforting, because it lessens this sense, which I think is a heroic leader kind of assumption, that there is something special about this particular man or this particular woman. See, in history, most of them are men. In the modern day, thankfully, lots of them are women. But we might even look at them. We might look at Brené Brown, who's a hero of mine, you know, and there was probably always going to be a sociologist in the early 21st century who talked about vulnerability, like who really opened that up as a topic for leadership, for population at large. Just happened to be this particularly, you know, this particular one from Texas, but it could have been somebody different. It's like 2 or maybe even 3 people created calculus at the same time, and the light bulb again was being worked on everywhere. These things, they were just emerging, and somebody did them. But it wasn't necessarily, we tell the story afterwards, it's a good story that there was something special about that person, and there probably was some special things about that person. But for me, this is always a reminder, well, we just got to do our thing in the corner of the world that we're in, and hope that, and trust that that is the thing to do, really.
Yeah, I think it makes me think of, you know, there's that one of the things that can hold us back is this kind of reification of someone who is successful, and also and that has all sorts of implications, you know, because we don't identify, because all of the messy bits have kind of been erased, and because we understand ourselves and experience ourselves as flawed people just doing whatever we're doing, we don't identify with that we could do something really big and profound, because all of the stuff gets erased. And so you assume that you can't, if you have that, it can't be present. The messiness can't be present to do the great stuff. Whereas I think telling a more human story around our process, our leadership, and looking for that story in compassionate ways around others is, for me, it feels like an interesting way to play with this. And I think of this as, like, you know, and Churchill is such an excellent example, because I know many people who would say he was, who will demonize him as well. And that need for someone to be like hero or villain.
Yeah, such a great point, Matthew.
Why do we need everyone to, how are we talking, where are we doing that with other people, and where are we doing that with ourselves? Why do we need to be one thing or the other? And it comes right back, it's so helpful that you started with fear, because I think this idea of a heroic leader as not feeling those things, not feeling fear, exposes us and other people to harm. The reason that fear exists is because it prevents harm. It does something useful if it's allowed to do what it to its right degree. It's like, okay, we go this far. We want to look over the edge, but we don't want to step over the edge. That being able to be with the ambiguity and allowing the ambiguity in ourselves and others. And I think, yes, it is doing stuff, but it's not doing stuff that's completely uninformed by those feelings. Is if you feel it's too much, do it, but a bit less. Don't not do it, but also you don't have to go all the way there. And I think that, when you're talking about the shine, the finishedness, the polishedness of stuff that we see and how it's associated with like leaders, and is like, there's absolutely, it's a partial story.
What I love about it is like, it's another version of it, isn't it? I just wrote down and circled all the way there, because this is another thing we confuse. Like we see the end product of someone's odyssey, and we think the first step on our odyssey has to look as the same as the end step on somebody else's. And for me, in my life, like that thing you're talking about there, I think, or one of the things you're talking about, was really important. So I read a book called The War of Art by Stephen Pressfield, but I could have read any number of others. Could have read Big Magic by Liz Gilbert, another fantastic book. And essentially what those two books and some other stories like them did for me was showed me that the assumptions I had, that people were invulnerable, didn't feel fear, didn't have the thoughts I had. So my assumption was, if I doubt that I'm a writer, then I'm probably not meant to be a writer. If I doubt that I'm a coach, if I doubt that I'm a leader, all those things, that's telling me something true about the world, because I can see these people and I don't hear their doubt. And what was great for me about reading The War of Art and Big Magic at the perfect time was this was some undoubtedly successful people who had written a bunch of stuff talking about the struggles. And that enabled me to deal with my fear in a much more wise way, which is exactly like you say. It is like, don't dismiss this, because then there's no heroism. And heroism, or courage at least, courage being acting in the face of fear, courage, incredibly, like that story I told about the woman who came to the coaching session, incredibly admirable thing. Like, we want the possibility for that in our lives, or at least I do. I want the possibility to be brave, right? It's necessarily scary, and then there's a feeling of courage, which is a very meaningful part of life. So we want that, but then also, exactly like you say, we want to manage that, right? Because if we don't know, this is my experience, I think I've seen it with clients too, I think, we don't know necessarily what the real fear is and what the imagined fear is until we do something. So that's why we have to do that thing. We have to, if it feels like too much, do less, do something, would be my guidance, but do less. And then just to catch it, for me, there's a woman I really admire called Jennifer Garvey Berger, who's a complexity theorist and a developmental psychologist. And she would say, one of her books is called Unlocking Leadership Mind Traps. That's her attempt to take her very complex psychology and complexity work kind of into something really pithy that a human can get hold of and use, who hasn't studied that stuff. And the mind traps piece is, there are some things that she believes from her research are evolved for are parts of us that evolved for simpler times that in the face of the complexity of the world just tie us in knots. And one of them is we love simple stories. So it's a simple story that Churchill is either the hero who saved the world from fascists, or the absolutely disgusting, disreputable person who caused terrible, terrible things to happen in India, and nothing in between, because that's a simple story. It's a lot harder for us to psychologically hold the fact that he actually probably, I haven't studied either, probably did both of those things.
That both of those things can be simultaneously true.
Right?
And
that's also true about us. We can be both simultaneously scared and simultaneously entirely unprepared for a role, or to be a writer, or to start a podcast, or be a guest on yours. We can be simultaneously scared and unprepared for those things, and it can be perfectly possible for us to do them.
Yeah, I really like that. And I think that relationship to changing how we see ourselves, and needing to see ourselves a certain way before we can do something, and perhaps needing others to see ourselves a certain way before we can do something, is a real limitation. And that's not to say that it isn't real, but to say that there are some degrees of freedom. There are edges. There are bits we can push. There is space to play with this stuff. But there is also, I think, acknowledging the other thing for me, thinking about people in leadership positions who often have a significant degree of privilege and power as a result of those positions, and therefore certain sorts of agency that other people don't have, is to allow yourself the fear and the uncertainty and the doubt, and to share those to the degree that you are comfortable and you can do so skillfully.
Yeah, good catch. It's like not too much, because don't forget the leaders in these roles with the power and the privilege are humans too, and they have to some of them will be listening, watching. They'll be like, but it's absolutely terrifying to do that in front of a big customer. So yeah, maybe don't do it in front of the big customer, right? Start with your team and the people you trust the most. And
don't talk about your deepest, most terrifying, overwhelming thing straight away. Talk about something that's small and at the edge and that you can handle. That's fine. Again, it's the starting and doing it. And I think, to kind of bring it into the, to join that up with some of the other stuff we've said. In fact, that whole process is that it's that ongoing cycle of engaging with the aversive emotion, with the thing that we don't want to, but not alone. That's the other thing about this heroic leader. It's so lonely as a model. It requires you to do it alone. And I think that invitation, where is my capacity? Where is my intrinsic value and joy? And where isn't it? And inviting other people to support you in that kind of mutuality.
Yeah, it's lovely. It's really lovely. I was getting caught, as you were saying that, by, I like from the very start of this conversation, obviously, hopefully it's been clear, I get interested in the stories humans tell, like what is held in I get interested in the psychological stories we tell, like about a heroic leader, but also what are the stories that we're attracted to, that we read. And my flash there, I'd have to think this through for longer to be sure, but my flash is the stories that really engages, they almost never have a lone protagonist. Because I think on some deep level, we know that story doesn't really work. Would Batman have really worked without Robin? I doubt it.
And Alfred, and
exactly. And all those people that were around, it's like, and the Lord of the Rings is in mind, all those great TV shows, most of the great TV shows, in fact, all of the great TV shows, I would say, of the last decade or two are ensemble casts. No matter how much, sometimes you can see that they're trying to make somebody the main character. Like in Friends, the sitcom, I think they were trying to make kind of Ross and Rachel the main character, but they couldn't do it because it didn't work. And some of that's storytelling, but some of it's, I think, that we know deep down, society knows really that nobody does it by themselves.
And I think in terms of a thing that we can let go of, is the idea that we have to do that. That idea of, and so often, people I work with develop, because they're capable and they're different, they develop habits around being too self-reliant, this kind of pathological self-reliance, which leads to them taking everything on themselves and overwhelming themselves, and ultimately not actually being able to realize where they really can offer. Like it becomes a strange limit. There's something powerful in just doing that bit, because we can do it really, really well, and we can do it on an ongoing basis, rather than trying to cover everything, cover the bits that we're not good at, and also to hide that from other people. And again, this is very much an edging into thing, and it is for me. That this is not easy. But that being able to invite others into, okay, where what do I know? What don't I know? And where's that edge? I love playing on that edge. That's partly, that's one of the things this show is about, partly, that space of uncertainty. And I think for me is, if your space of if uncertainty is something you do not enjoy, that brings you, the thought of it sends a shiver down your spine, then be clear about that and engage with people who love it. Because there are those of us that do. And if you fall into that latter category, then allow yourself that, that curiosity, that weirdness, that the exploration, the navigation, because we also learn to hide that. And I think that on both sides we can support one another better. There are millions of those examples. That's just the one example that comes to mind in this context. But by allowing ourselves that, what we're good at and what we're not good at, we also invite others to do the same.
Yeah, it's lovely. And the piece about uncertainty just makes me think, for the people that do hate uncertainty, I understand. It's hard to deal with in some parts of our life, especially if there's too much of it. And for the people who love it, I understand that sometimes loving uncertainty, or at least what would it be, thriving in the curiosity, downsides to that too sometimes. There are times when I wish that I didn't question and doubt everything so much, because it's quite painful to question and doubt myself, and question and doubt which removal company to hire. We were talking about that just before we went live. These things are difficult, and I think for me, one of the themes of this conversation has been it is the acceptance that if we're too tight with if we hold anything almost too tightly, then in the end that's going to get us into trouble.
And I think that idea of the heroic leader as someone who holds things so tightly, who controls everything.
Who can control everything because they're such a hero, right?
Exactly. That, if we're going to forget something about this idea, then that's the one to forget, I think. Yeah. That idea that we have to have that tight control over everything.
I think a big moment in my development was when I decided to make saying I don't know a practice. When I decided to start saying, really, and just asking. Because I'm a curious person, but I would hide it. I would have this kind of it was painful. It's like someone will be talking about something and I just wouldn't understand the word. And it has been a wonderful, freeing experience to say, I don't know, more and more and more. And I think it's not easy. And again, find the places to do it. And I'm lucky to be outside of an organization. I kind of know that. I'm lucky to be who I am, but in lots of ways. But the practice of I don't know, or I've changed my mind, but that's much harder. I don't know is a lot easier to say and to notice. Changing minds tends to happen over long, long periods. But saying those things, that feels like an amazing practice.
I love that. And, there's a pleasure in it, a pleasure in the opportunity of learning something new, finding something out. Because I'm curious, I love that. And it gives someone else that opportunity to give that to me.
Yeah, it's also an act of leadership, Matthew, like a real leadership. Because when you do things like that, in the way you were talking about earlier in the conversation, the being leadership, right? When you be vulnerable or be the kind of person who says, I actually don't know, that allows and invites other people to do that as well, instead of us both and all getting locked in a false invulnerability competition.
Absolutely. No, I think that's a great way to wrap things up. So thank you so much for this conversation. I've really got a lot from it, and I hope everyone in the audience did too. If people want to get in touch with you, what's the best way for them to do so? So we've got your website in the show notes, and you mentioned the podcast and the books. But is there anything specific that you'd like to invite people to connect with? What would you like people to? Would you like people to get in touch? How about what?
Yeah. So my website is the best place to find everything that I do. It's got links to the podcasts and the books. I'm on all the social media, but I tend to be most active on LinkedIn, and that's partly for a long time that I've had a writing practice on there, which is really an uncertainty practice. So it's been, I didn't start these things sometimes and you don't know where they're going to lead, but I realized a couple of years ago when one of my mentors was talking to me about it, so I write an article in 12 minutes each week with a timer, proofread it once, post it online. And what my mentor, Robert Holden, said was he just loved that so much because you don't have to try and know everything in 12 minutes. Whereas when he's writing a book, he's just written one about purpose. He wrote one about love. He feels like he has to try and basically collect everything in that. So because of that writing practice, you can read that on LinkedIn or on my website. I'm on LinkedIn at most of all the social media, which is funny because we were talking a bit about how it's a place of kind of polishedness, and it's interesting to be on there like we are now. And I'm with my blog doing unpolishedness almost by design. But I'm glad that we're both there doing that delightful Dissent, Matthew. So yeah, be in touch with me. And what I'm interested in, really, I'm always interested in. So one of the things that I struggle with is how do I remember the impact of the work that I'm doing? So it's like, I don't think we need this to keep going, but it often helps. So if there's been something that's sparked by this conversation that's made a difference to you, like, let me know, because that's part of how, I remember that in the face of never quite knowing that the work we're doing is making a difference, even a small one.
I think that's such a lovely invitation in this space is I often see people doing amazing stuff, and I think they don't want me to tell them how great they are. They know how great they are. Everyone I've contacted has been grateful, engaged. We're all kind of we know, none of us know, and it's a really kind gift from anyone. So yeah, very much encourage anyone who has resonated. It's not that you have valued any of it is not a trivial thing that we're taking for granted. Absolutely not, I think.
No, absolutely not.
So yeah, thank you. You mentioned a couple of books. Is there anything particular that you think it would be good for people to check out or follow up? If not, no worries. We can.
So at the moment, because I recently read her most recent book, Jennifer Garvey Berger's books, particularly the two most recent ones, they're really practical. They're about a lot of what we've been talking about, dealing with uncertainty. How do you say I don't know? Those kind of pieces. So the most recent ones are Unlocking Leadership Mind Traps and Unleashing Your Complexity Genius. They're really practical. They're short, like they're very lean books, and so that makes them easy to recommend and give. And for me, the ones that kind of spawned the bit of my work, my books, which are about how do we like do the thing, even when we're afraid, really. Like I said, The War of Art by Steve Pressfield and Big Magic by Liz Gilbert are great places to go if that was, as are, of course, my books, but it's harder to say that. I've got better at saying it.
Yeah, definitely. No, and do include your own books in that, I think. Interestingly, The War of Art for me is right in this position of like very ambiguous, like to a high degree, because I found some of it incredibly useful and some of it absolutely just made me so angry.
Yeah.
And it's a really, really interesting, like that idea that something can be valuable and useful, but also piss you off. is right to the heart of what we've been talking about today. So yeah,
it absolutely is, isn't it? It's so funny, and it's almost like I wonder if it's an increasingly important skill to be able to hold, like we said, hold those two things at once, but also find the useful thing in there and use it. Not throw the baby out with the bathwater. I'm just wondering. I've never really thought about it before, but I can imagine The War of Art would annoy a lot of people in a lot of ways, but really changed my life.
Yeah. No, wonderful. Thank you so much. Really enjoyed having you on the show. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Matthew. It's been a total pleasure.
Great, thank you. And so I hope that got you thinking in the audience. It really did me. So please do reach out and ask both of us or whoever you really, whoever, just continue the conversation. And it is your support in the audience that makes this possible, or at the very least legitimizes my excuse to talk to really interesting people doing cool stuff. So please do share it, like it, get it out there, and share the conversation, share what you felt about it, whether that's positive or negative, or hopefully in the context of this conversation, maybe a bit of both. So please do just share how you've engaged with it as well. Upcoming and past episodes are available on YouTube and LinkedIn, and the podcast is available if you search for Delightful Dissent on your favorite podcast platform, though at time of recording those podcasts are quite out of date because there are still some technical issues getting them out there. So if you want the latest up-to-date stuff, it is only on the live streaming platforms, though hopefully that situation will be resolved relatively soon. The next episode, I'm going to be talking to Jeannie Love, who is a coach who works with neurodivergent professionals, executives, and entrepreneurs, helping them get stuff done in their own way. And we're going to be talking, interestingly, relatedly to this conversation, about best practice. Now, this is like sharing what works is really helpful, and doing things that work is really helpful. But I've seen so many really inappropriate, poor solutions forced onto something because they were apparently best practice. And I think I'm really looking forward to getting into this and how we can work with the idea. And that's going to be at 5 p.m. UK time on Thursday, the 1st of December. So I very much hope to see you then. But in the meantime, please do go out there and make some delightful dissent of your own. Thanks and goodbye.